I titled my sermon What Follows because in Scripture we're always looking at clues and hints and trying to perceive from sometimes the least amount of words possible what's going on next, where this is and what happened. And here we're setting a bit of time. In verse 14 it said, Now after John was arrested. Now after John was arrested. So that's a moment in time, that's an event. And it turns out that that event was so important and so significant that we're dating some of everything that followed from that moment. So I got to thinking about important dates and times, things in my life or in yours that have changed everything. And all we need to do is invoke that date or that moment and remember what happened and know that we as a group were collectively changed, or maybe just I or my family. So I'm going to throw out October 20th, 1990. I'll move right along and say that that's the first day I met Fran. It was a Saturday. It was about 1 o'clock. And I went to pick her up for a wedding. Friends of ours were getting married, but I didn't know her, at least hadn't met her. I was riding with two of my guy friends. It was about an hour away. And they hustled around and got dates. So they called me up on Thursday before the wedding on Saturday and said, guess what? You're bumped out of the car. We each have a date now. You don't get to ride with us. I said, okay, I have a car. And they said, well, that's fine, but there's this other girl, her name's Fran, you might want to ride with her or see if she wants to ride with you, because it was a bit of a hike. So I called her up and she seemed nice, and October 20th, 1990, about 1 o'clock I met her. I remember one time telling that story, and I said, I can still remember what she was wearing, which was a black dress with little pretty blue flowers. And a lady listening said, oh no, she said, that's too much. And she turned to Fran and she said, is that right? And Fran said, yeah, that was the dress. What moments in time do you set your life by? What do you remember? Your birthday or graduation, maybe? Do you think about weddings of yourself or family members, something significant that happened there? Do you date from a new job or a new home? It's hard to talk about time and shared events without mentioning 9/11, but as soon as I do, we all have an image. So let's also say D-Day, not one that I was here for, but one that we share as a country. It changed everything. Here's one. I'll see how many of you recognize this one. January 2nd, 1998. No Husker fans here? January 2nd, 1998 at the Orange Bowl. Who was playing that day? Okay. I thought I might get a little more reaction. What follows? What came after that? After John was arrested, everything changed. John was really important in this story, in the Bible, in Mark. He was the heralder of Christ. We know, particularly from from Luke, that they were related. Elizabeth and Mary were friends. They visited before the boys arrived. We know from the Gospel of John that there seemed to be simultaneous ministries of John the Baptist and Jesus even. In Luke, the disciples asked Jesus to teach him to pray like John's disciples do. The shadow of John, the presence of John, what John was doing, his disciples, hangs over the whole, particularly the beginning of all the Gospels. So John's arrest was huge. He was important to Jesus personally. He was his baptizer. Jesus submitted to baptism under John. He was family, he was the herald, and we know how his arrest and trial and death followed. It foreshadows Jesus' own. Everything that follows. So I bring this up because we've entered into a time. We've entered into the season of Lent, the time before Easter. And for habitual Christians or lifelong Christians, it is difficult, I think, to reclaim that newness, to reclaim that vitality, to grab hold of the approaching concern, fear, excitement maybe. What are we setting for? We know the whole story, but we have to reclaim a little bit of that innocence. We have to mark with concern. Did you hear? John got arrested. Did you hear what's going on? Lent is a time for us to reflect and to remember our own landmarks. Some of them we can trumpet and be proud of, some of them not so. All of them our own life. It's meant to be a time of prayer and reflection, a time to sort of clear the decks, to make amends, to double check, to fix the broken, to heal the sore, to be ready for what is coming. In the story, as we read this morning, it says in verse 12, the Spirit drove Jesus into the wilderness immediately following his baptism, and there he was tempted. We know this world to be a wilderness of possibilities of temptation. We know ourselves to be vulnerable. We know we've had times that were more successful than others. But part of the humanity of Christ shines here, because he knows too. He shared that time, but we share it with him. He was there before us. He was in the wilderness for 40 days, and that rings a lot of familiar bells. When we read that sentence, we think wilderness. That meant so much to the people of Jesus' day, to the hearers of this story, to you and to me. For Israel, the wilderness was a place to get lost. The wilderness was a place of danger, of wandering. It was also a place of God's care, also a place of discovery, of call. Ishmael and Moses wandered in the wilderness. Others did too, the nation of Israel, so many people. But he was in the wilderness for 40 days. And that number 2 has significance. That number 2 rings a bell of a long time. Literally, it was used over and over in the Old Testament. We can think of 40 days in our own life as, well, it's more than a month. I mean, that's a long time. And what happened? Well, he was tempted by Satan. Sort of a redundant sentence there. Satan is the tempter, so he was tempted by tempting. And he was with wild beasts, it says in verse 13. Wild beasts, that's something that Mark includes only. Those 2 words, wild beast. Mark is spare in the extreme, and we have to grab hold of whatever he puts in there and ask ourselves, well, why did he put those 2 words in? Why is he going out of his way to emphasize the wild beasts? Well, again, our minds go back to the story, to the beginning. We're already of a mind of the wilderness and what it represents. We're already of a mind of the 40 and what that means. Animals and people, it's been trouble since Adam and Eve. Whenever we've got animals around, at least wild animals, we've got a problem. The snake in the garden, anybody? Everything that followed from there. But Jesus was successful. In part, there were angels there. But for our thought this morning, for our reflection, I want to suggest that there is a bigger possibility. That it's not just Jesus overcoming temptation, which he did, and for that, well, praise be. But there's a new possibility in being put forward. That these fearful things, the wilderness and the 40, the wild animals, have been overcome. That somehow this mixture that has spelled nothing but trouble for the whole of the Old Testament are somehow new and different, having been changed. that the power of God to create is still creative, that the opportunity for something new has arrived. Jesus saw the temptation and overcame it. He saw the wilderness and was steadfast. He saw the wild animals without fear. He met these things head on and overcame them. He was successful where others had failed. He puts forward a new possibility for us. From here forward, it can be different. From here forward, it can be new. So there are lots of breaks and dates and significant landmarks in this story. The baptism of Jesus, the temptation in the wilderness, the new possibilities that followed, the arrest of John. What follows? What follows? From what points in your life do you date? What are the significant events since the accident, since the death of Grandma, since the windfall that we made that one amazing year, since the birth of our children, our grandchildren, since those new neighbors came in who were so much better than the old? Today is Blue Sunday. Some of you are wearing blue or remembered blue. I'm wearing a blue shirt with pride because it has been my privilege to serve Presbyterian Disaster Assistance, the PDA, a couple of times. We took a group to Biloxi, Mississippi following Katrina. There's a shared experience for our country, for those that lived through it. We drove a group of about 8 men from Mendon down. It took 30 or so hours. It was a long drive. And I'll never forget those people and those stories. I talked with family after family. One couple had done everything they were supposed to do for a hurricane. The problem with Katrina was it was so much more than they'd had before. And this family had barricaded their windows. They had put things away in a manner they were supposed to. And they were in their house, which was okay. Except so much more water came in, so much more, that all of a sudden their house began to fill, and knee-deep and waist-deep, and they thought, well, maybe we should leave. But the only door left open was their back door, and they had a wooden patio, and it floated as the water rose, and they had put posts on each corner so it wouldn't go away, and they were literally trapped in their own home. And they talked to me about standing around their kitchen table and holding hands as the water got higher and praying each other into heaven. She was not overly tall. He was a tall man, but they said that that water got to about here and stopped. The water drained away. They lived to tell the story. That's how I know it. Some people did not. There were some people who were trapped in precisely the same kind of circumstances that did not live. We had trouble getting around down there because everything had changed. I saw entire city blocks that looked like you had just taken your arm across a table with Lincoln Logs or Legos and just done like that. Street signs and foundations, lampposts, everything, trees, just gone. You could walk around someone's home, at least the ground floor, because the tile and carpet and linoleum were sometimes still affixed. But it was very difficult to drive around because there's no street signs. We're visitors, but even the people that lived there couldn't find their way. People would take plywood and spray paint street names and just sort of lay them on the ground. Everything changed. Everything. We went back the following year and worked another season. We visited a couple of the homes that we had talked to. That couple was doing better. Their home had been restored. They had their health and things, and so their lives moved forward. Others were not as lucky. We heard a variety of stories. But everything that followed was different. Everything that followed had changed. On this blue Sunday, if you will, I think of my 10th grade year in high school. We traveled to a camp called Camp Sky Anchor, meaning to put your anchor in the sky where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. So this man had been a sailor, and this was on the coast of Virginia, so Sky Anchor, and they had a little logo with the cross and an anchor. And it was a day camp for children in the city who would come out, and as a sophomore in high school, I was nervous about working with kids. I didn't have any younger brothers or sisters. I was afraid I would break them or something. And they gave me the 5-year-olds with Lisa Adderholt. Now, my initial inclination was to decline the offer, but I had a crush on Lisa. Don't tell Fran. No, that's the sophomore year in high school. So I took it because I was excited. And what I found out is those kids were very forgiving. Those kids wanted to be there. They listened mostly. They were 5 and energetic, but we had a great time. While I was there, my cousin came to visit me. Now, she was my aunt's sister, and we visited for a time. And 2 years later, my cousin was in a wreck, and I never saw her again. Everything changed for me. My own faith grew exponentially in that camp because I realized I had a heart for service. I was excited by the possibilities. Our group grew better. Our experience at church was enriched, and that carried us forward. I had time with my cousin that I wasn't going to get again. Everything changed. In seminary, I got to go on a trip to Central America, to Nicaragua, Guatemala, and Costa Rica. And in Nicaragua, we went to a church that was adjacent to the city dump. And the poverty there was incredible. The leanness and thinness of their survival was amazing. But we met neat people who were engaged and excited. We met a pastor of a church that took us inside, and this church was really kind of nice given where we were. It was a decent-sized room with some benches, and they had painted the walls, and as we looked at the walls, we saw this one story that was familiar. It was the story of the lost sheep. If I had 99 sheep and one was lost, what would I do? Leave the 99 and go get the one, remember? But they painted where this sheep was lost, and it was the edge of a cliff and barely hanging on, and there were about 2 wolves with very sharp teeth, and there was this little boy with a staff reaching out. I was sort of blown away by how intense this picture was, and then I realized this is their experience a lot of the days. This is how their world feels to them. And part of why they're there is because Jesus Christ is after them. They are part of God's flock, and He will not let them go. That wasn't a message we necessarily needed to hear, we privileged Presbyterians from the US of A. Well, needed to hear there. We needed to hear it. We needed to hear it a lot. In that same church on the other wall was a cityscape, a little like where they were. They could see the Capitol. And there were, buildings and bridges and an airplane or two. But when we got to looking, the airplane wasn't just flying straight, it was sort of crashing. There was a car, not just on the highway, but sort of driving off of the bridge. There were fires and things, and it looked pretty awful. And by each little airplane and car or fire, there were these little white sort of things going up. And we said, what is that? And they said, well, that's the Spirit being lifted up into heaven at the rapture, which is in the Bible. This is good biblical study. But they were looking forward to that in a way that perhaps we of privilege were not. Because the world they were in was tough and hard. The world they were having to fight fought them and won too often. They looked forward to something that would change everything. And for us as a group, we were indelibly marked by having visited that church on that day. I stay in touch with some of my friends from that trip, and we all cite that visit and that stay. We all cite that conversation as changing of ourselves because it helped us wake up to the incredible hardships some have. And this was in Nicaragua, but I humbly submit there are some closer to home that have such trouble, that have such challenge. And we need to find a way to draw a line in the sand this day and say, from here forward, everything changes. From here forward, we will be different and new. From here forward, we will embrace the creative possibilities of a created God who called us into being and calls new reality into being every day. We can draw a line that says this is new. This is different. We can be different. We can be different in Christ. We don't have to do it all. That's God's job. We just need to be messengers, servants, reacher outers. It doesn't have to be complicated. Don't need a whole stack of new things. God reaches out and tears open the world to create the possibility. In our reading, it says, verse 10, and just as he was coming up out of the water, he saw the heavens torn apart. In my children's sermon this morning, I don't want to make a mess. Will you help me? You hold half of that. There you go. It's still full. But this is a science lesson from 2,000 years ago, because that little rock in that bag, for our purposes, we're going to call Earth. And the water around it is the universe as they understood it. Because if you went up in the sky, what would come down sometimes? Rain, water. If you dug in the ground, what would you sometimes find? Right? The world was in a water ball, surrounded. And it says that the heavens ripped open and God spoke. Thank you. So at the top of the world was God ripping the heavens, and at the bottom of the world was Jesus coming up out of the water. From the top of the world to the bottom of the world, it was ripped open, and God spoke. From here forward, everything's new. Everything's different. And part of why we can key on that is because Mark only uses that verb and that word one other time at the end of the gospel, 15:38. Jesus dies on the cross, the curtain is torn. From here forward, everything is different. And we are blessed with the opportunity to be a part of that today. Amen.